think we can go ahead and get started. Well, let me go ahead and do a soft start and then we'll turn it over to our host. But thank you everyone for joining us today for this exciting webinar on innovation management. And for those of you who are new to KMI, just a quick reminder of who we are. We are home to the Certified Knowledge Manager program. That's the #1 certification in KM worldwide. You can go to our classes header here for more information on that program. We're also known for the specialist curriculum, which is a deep dive into a specific KM topic or KM related topic. And today we're taking a closer look at innovation management. And we happen to have the debut class coming up the end of June, which our host today is the author and instructor of, and we're excited to give a little sneak peek about that class as well as our deep dive today into innovation management. But excited about the debut, and we'll put a link here in the chat on where to go for more information on this exciting class coming up. But today, without further ado, let me hand you over to Dr. John Lewis. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Lewis.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Let me share my slides. All right. Well, welcome everyone to this Introduction to Innovation Management. I'm John Lewis, the author of Story Thinking. And I've got a few topics I want to hit today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Starting with some great quotes. Albert Einstein said, "Innovation is not the product of logical thought, although the result is tied to logical structure." So we're going to take a look at the story thinking cycle as this logical structure. Ed Roberts at MIT says innovation equals invention times commercialization. So we're going to take a look at the story thinking cycle as an innovation cycle where there's two halves, one where we're coming up with ideas and one where we are using those ideas, putting them to use. Steve Jobs says innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity, not a threat. So we'll take a look at the 20 disruption archetypes. And Carl Jung says the greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a great tension of opposites. So we'll take a look at creative tension within the story cycle. And of course, you can't have a list of quotes without Mark Twain. He says they did not know it was impossible, so they did it. So we'll take a look at the could work beliefs that happen with stories and compare that to won't work beliefs. For an organization in the knowledge economy, the ability to learn faster than your competitors may be the only sustainable competitive advantage. And what he's describing here is not learning as in memorizing steps, as on the left-hand side. You have your products and services that you offer now, and people in your organization are learning how to describe and use those. What he's talking about is taking everything we know about learning, including innovation, and making that your organization's core competency so that you're a learning organization and producing new products and services. Now, some people define a learning organization as one that can complete a few steps and do these things, and now you're awarded the title of learning organization. I define it a little bit differently. I say that all organizations are learning organizations, some with more learning disabilities than others. And today we'll take care, hopefully, of some of those disabilities. Let's start with this. Peter Senge says the leader's new work is building learning organizations. Organizations today understand that they are either becoming thought leaders or they're becoming obsolete. And when pioneer time is lacking, innovators leave large organizations. So pioneer time in your organization might be every Friday afternoon is some playtime and trying new ideas. Maybe it's a sabbatical for someone who's been there for a while. And if you don't get a chance to do that, then you'll probably go off and be an entrepreneur. Knowledge and innovation management requires developing all four learner types. We always say in our organization, we'll be developing employees from novice to expert and think that it stops there. But there's a period of time when we're questioning the very models that our experts are operating from and spending time being inventive, not necessarily productive, being a pioneer where half the things that we're trying aren't working and HR departments aren't sure how to measure you at that point. And then we can finally emerge with working ideas that we're productive with as a thought leader. So that's the idea of the learning S-curve that has to be happening with the organization as you're developing people. You might have noticed in the field of knowledge management that traditionally knowledge creation is not a focus. We've focused on knowledge capture, storage, sharing, transfer. But today we're going to look at knowledge creation in a deeper way. And we'll do that by looking at story structure. Neuroscience says we are wired for story. The power of story is physiological, not just psychological. We think in story. It's hardwired in our brain. Storytelling is far too powerful a tool to be relegated to the realms of bedtime fables or barroom banter. It's how humans, in fact, make sense of the world. Once we accept that, we can start to use it to its full constructive potential. And that's what we're going to start doing today. The first thing we have to do is unlearn this idea that story equals storytelling. We always say story or storytelling as though when we say story, we mean we're telling something. Well, storytelling uses story as a communication strategy. But story thinking isn't about telling a story. It's about living a better story. Story thinking uses story as an operational strategy. As Carl Jung says, you are in a story, whether you know it or not. So what is the structure of story? We can start with this one from Joseph Campbell, you may be familiar with, which shaped George Lucas's Star Wars saga, The Hero's Journey. So if you're not familiar with it, the main point here is that notice at the bottom, it's like gravity, really. So we start with our status quo. We're minding our own business. This is our daily routine. And then something happens and it moves us through this cycle. And then we return transformed in some way. So that's generally the way that story cycles are described. Let's take a look at how we might think about, since we're in a story, how we would think about this pattern at work. We had successful operations at work, but we knew more competition was coming. We discovered a new idea that we could incorporate and created a new vision. Development took some time, but it came together. Now operations are even better. So when we talk about work, we're actually talking about the story of work, not from a storytelling standpoint, but a story thinking standpoint. This is actually what we did. And notice this word automation at the bottom. We tend to think of that as mechanical automation. It really just means mindless work. And so I'm sure all of us have done 10 things today that we didn't have to think about. It was just part of our codified routine. So let's take a look at the inside of this cycle, the mindsets underlying story structure. You probably noticed a question mark, a period, an exclamation point at the end of sentences across many languages. It's more than just for communication or telling. It's actually how we're operating. And you probably heard it either works or it doesn't work. Well, there's a third workability belief called could work. And the combination of these mindsets is what generates what phase we're in as we move through story structure. So at the bottom, when we say automation, what does that mean? It means we're in a does work reactive mindset, a belief that that's what we're doing. And at the top, ideation means we're in a could work and questioning mindset. So if you're leading people through change, transformational change, innovation, it's not just understanding what to do in each phase. It's about understanding how to cross the lines. At some point, we're not asking the question, could this work? At some point, we have to dedicate ourselves to say, this could work. Let's take a look at some examples of this in a working environment. So what do we mean by working in automation? So characteristics is operating on autopilot, status quo, routine and daily operations. And our innovations that we eventually come up with on the other side at the top have to be thought of from the standpoint of how will this idea work in routine. Success measures in automation is proficiency, predictable routines, if then, low amount of variation, and common failures are firefighting as the norm, or lots of workarounds as the norm. At some point, the workarounds should be handled as taking care of that with a new design. How about working in disruption? So this is preparing and respond to the situations out of the ordinary, identify scope and priorities, and prepared solutions for identified risks. What about investigation? Asking questions to understand updated and detailed situational awareness, finding underlying root causes and root factors, asking the 5 whys and the 5 whats. Ideation, brainstorming and diversity of initial ideas. That's the opening, and transparency in selection of ideas, sort of closing that out. Balancing ingenuity and attainability, and articulating risks and rewards of chosen idea. What's it like when we're in expectation, building something, a project, setting and fulfilling expectations, acting to execute and design and plan established in the ideation phase, and clear expectations and development processes. Affirmation is just confirming that what we thought could work does work. You probably see that in testing and use cases for that at work. There's a place for that in our story structure. So with that overview of what we mean by working in a story structure, one of the studies that was done is a look at 50 models related to change compared to story structure. And if we could use chat right now, I'm just curious if you could enter the number of the model that you mostly use, if you're certified in it or you've heard of it, or if it's the one you like the most. I'm always curious when I present this what model people are into. Okay, we don't get trust but verify very many times. Okay, so we've got some government workers with us here today. That's great. Yeah, these are okay. So multiple numbers. So a few of you like several of these models. It's interesting as I was looking at models related to change, either change, innovation, learning, leadership, that a lot of these are step-based. Do these things in this order. And a lot of them are 50 years old. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, numbers still coming in. What I want to do is show you what I mean by compared to story thinking. So let's say, for example, you're certified in project management, and they tell you, here's the steps you need to follow: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And you fill out a bunch of information under that. You kind of get it. It sort of makes sense. Why does it sort of make sense to us? It's because when you map it over top of story structure, those steps that you've memorized, you see that you've closed all the gaps. You're covering the basis of what the sense-making process, a story, is looking for. Or what do we mean by waterfall methodology? So you've got requirements, and then design, develop, test, deploy, and maintain it in automation. And how's that different from what we mean by agile? And there's a lot of different things people mean by agile, including, where they stand up and all of that. Essentially, at its root, it just means not waterfall, not linear. It means you have 2 arrowheads on each arrow. You can go forward and backwards as you're moving through the story cycle. One more page of comparisons, just so you get the idea. I won't go through all 50. So you may be certified in 6 Sigma, and it has a thinking model called DMAIC, which means define, measure, analyze, improve, control. If you're certified, you probably know most of the training is in investigation with analyze, and how to analyze. Statistical root cause analysis is a big part of this, so that you can determine what the key problem is and end up back in automation, controlling your environment with low variations. That's why it came from a a manufacturing idea. Well, controlling things with low variations is kind of the opposite of innovation. And so some companies have had to stop using Six Sigma. It was affecting their innovation. They weren't sure why. We can take a look at why that happens with a very simple innovation, rule innovation model that says be bold, seek the available, and repurpose. As you map those 3 steps, you can see that, well, it's saying pick a big idea in disruption, something that's a big problem. And instead of analyzing root cause analysis, what went wrong, investigations asking completely different questions. Seek the available, what's already out there. Don't reinvent something. Just see what's there. That's the investigation. Whole different thing that you're doing at that part of the story, and then repurpose it. So let's say that you noticed that you wanted to be bold and solve a big transportation problem that people could not move around. There's no cab service. And you looked around and to seek the available, and you said, I noticed that there are some cars and they seem to have cell phones. And to repurpose that, you decided maybe these people wouldn't mind getting paid to drive people around. So if you had this simple model, you could have invented Uber. That's just a different way of thinking about moving through a story. And a popular model in innovation is design thinking, which starts by empathizing with someone trying to do their work, and then define, ideate, prototype, test, and then implement it. Okay? So let's take a look at what creative tension is about. It's a good thing. Well, a 1950s organization chart separated roles for R&D and operations. You can see in an org chart, you can spend 20 years in your career in doing one type of thinking or the other. Today's organizations try to balance their time between knowledge exploration and knowledge exploitation. In the innovation management literature, they call it organizational ambidexterity. And there's a tension between when you're just going to keep repeating the same thing and how much time you should devote to transformational work and ideation and invention of new things. And this idea of tension between the top and the bottom can extend to individuals. When you're having knowledge sharing sessions, you might pair these people together. Someone that comes up with ideas and someone that knows how things work in the real world, but also someone that sees things that can go wrong and someone that likes to build things, or people that know, how to remember what's working, and people that are looking and digging into new trends. And in one particular study, we changed the names, looking at individuals who are in particular focused in certain areas of the story process. This is what their team looked like. So unhealthy conflict is a result of personalizing the tension, but healthy organizations recognize that conflict is a natural and important aspect. And here we see Larry Jones all by himself, who loves spreadsheets and digging in and diving in and finding root causes of problems before we start building out code and designing for projects. And one of the reasons that a lot of projects fail, we don't spend enough time looking into what the real problem is. So on this team, we went back and asked, where's Larry? And they said, he was always coming in with ideas after we already started a project, which is scope creep. And he wasn't a good team fit. So that's the way we talk when we don't realize we're working in a story and we need all parts of it represented. Here's another example, a real example across companies and across time. The Xerox PARC invented the first PC with a mouse and GUI. Apple then picked that up and launched the Lisa and Macintosh. And then Microsoft made it the norm, the industry norm, of using a mouse instead of typing commands like dir, where what's in the directory, that sort of thing. So this is a good example of the equation we saw earlier from MIT, that innovation equals invention times commercialization. And we realized that Apple didn't really invent this. It came from Xerox PARC, and it's their ability to commercialize. Same thing with MP3 player, that sort of thing. It comes from other places. They're just really good at adding the other piece. It's not just the invention that creates innovation. It has to be put to work and to use where people can apply it. What we're also seeing is the basic difference between what we call basic research, applied research, and operational thinking from these three companies. And I just found it interesting that Xerox, their first mouse had 3 buttons. Apple says we do 1 button, and Microsoft has 2 buttons. A book was written about this, Fumbling the Future, as if Xerox did something wrong. But I think it would be rewritten now to realize that these are PhDs studying this problem of memorizing things, and that's harder to do really than to recognize something that you can click on and coming up with an idea. So they did their job, and they also introduced it to people that could keep the story going. So whatever your strengths are as an individual, as an organization, you don't have to have all the bases covered. You just have to make sure that you're teaming with other people to close that gap. So in general, you want to look at the model of story structure and the knowledge flow, which is looking at how you move through the story as well as across the board. And then measure that and look at, okay, what's the overall scores you might address from a KPI standpoint? What are the key things that you want to have happen? Because if you're really low on one of these, it could be the place that's keeping innovation from spinning around and continually moving in your organization. And with that information, then you can come up with improvement strategies for people, process, and technologies. So, for example, if you're doing a technology strategy, you might say, well, we have a way of capturing information and the answer that we provide to customers, that's our insert capability. But you may not have a discovery capability, either the people, process, or technologies on the other side of the cycle that is finding interesting connections. So this leads us to a question of overall innovation maturity. You could just have no improvements entertained, sustaining operation, or creativity, isolated events, or trial and error, experimentation, or actually reach a point where you have an integrated R&D and operations, ongoing innovations, and organizational ambidexterity. So let me show you an example of that. This was the thinking of Steve Jobs at Apple. As he started off with the iPod, he already knew there was going to be an iPad. And he allowed each generation to fund the R&D for the next generation. So this is a way of thinking about innovation maturity, of balancing between when you'll put something in production and operations and start being productive with it and even generating funds with it, as it allows you to fund the additional R&D that's going on and then cycle that through. So let's talk about methodology as it relates to innovation management. Thomas Kuhn showed us that learning involves periodic revolutions in our understanding and underlying models. So Einstein began his famous talk by saying, "Forgive me, Newton." He was about to replace Newton's models of how a planetary motion, of how they move, with his own. And he had an audience that was prepared to listen to this because they could all see that the planet of Mercury, being so close to the gravitational force of the sun, was not actually moving the way that Newton's models had predicted. So as he's replacing those models, he started by saying, "Forgive me," because this process is not to disparage older models, but to acknowledge that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So it's with this lens that I was curious about MIT's a review of design thinking that they published earlier this year that concluded that design processes themselves need to evolve beyond design thinking as one of our key models that we use in innovation management. So as I pointed out in lots of examples, The first step of the design thinking process is for the designer to empathize with the end user through close observation of the problem. This puts the designer's own sense of empathy at the center of both the problem and the solution, with empathy over expertise being one of the problems. And so you can dive into that. I've left the link at the top. You can read into that. And my observations as I looked at that, my dissertation area is in mental models. So I know that most models are not perfect. Probably none of them are. So I was curious of their review of this one. And essentially, my sense is since earlier models were created, we've learned a lot more about dopamine, emotions, and even being wired for story. With empathy as step one, the focus is on the problem, not the opportunity. And that changes our mindset. You can think about what we saw earlier, the difference between Six Sigma and the questions you're asking, like what went wrong, versus what's available. It takes you in a different place. And also, a step-based methodology, they work for predetermined outcomes, but innovation requires activating the creative mind in nonlinear ways. And it requires a map in addition to directions. So I would say that the map is story structure. And with that, let's take a look at moving through story structure. And the question is, where do you start? Well, some say let's start with a dream, but a dream without a goal is imaginative thinking. So let's start with a goal. Well, a goal without a process is wishful thinking. Well, let's start with a process. Well, a process without a dream is robotic thinking. So the point is to start with where you are. If you only have a process and someone comes in and says, I have an idea that I thought of, you can't say, well, we're not ready to capture that. That's step 3. You're going to have to move through our process. So you want to be able to design innovation management systems in your organization where you can start where people are with a dream. They can start an ideation or a goal that they already know the outcome, because stories is storytelling. You move through it sequentially, but when you say, here's my goal, you set that at the beginning. You're gonna start it in affirmation. This is where I want to end up. And then disruption, something's happened, I want to move through a process. So we'll take a look at all 3 of these. In ideation, be prepared to capture innovation ideas and then connect and complete other supporting content. So they say, I've got an idea, great. And then you start to backfill in. Okay, how do you see this working in routine? What problem do you think it solves for someone? How feasible is this project? You can start backfilling in, but initially capture ideas. If you start an affirmation, here's my goal, then you want to capture feedback about that goal that will help you get there. If you're familiar with double loop learning, this is quad loop learning. It's based on story thinking. It's just more exact than double loop learning, taking the goal and giving feedback back to the other phases of the story. So you could say, well, we know how to do it, we're just not doing it correctly. So you've got some compliant feedback. It says, compliant, here's an example. Says it may be time to stop for the day. Productive feedback may say that it's time to sharpen the axe. Inventive feedback may say it's time to invent a chainsaw. And perceptive feedback says it may be time to research another form of energy beyond wood. So we're thinking about each phase differently. And we want to make sure when we're in our ideation phase, thinking of ideas, that we're not just thinking of ideas to be compliant or just productive and optimizing the current system. So we might talk about ways that we could reduce waste and variation. Well, we have Lean and Six Sigma for that. Those are models that exist that work well for optimizing your current system. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about the ideas that are coming in and that they're reaching these higher levels of feedback. So with that, let's talk about the process starting in disruption with the I let them method. I let them looking at the first letter of each step. Identify opportunities, look into gap analyses, envision a solution, develop solution, evaluate trueness, and maintain status quo. And when we get to each step, there's a shape that helps us think about what we have to accomplish there. We'll take a look at that as we go through. So in disruption, we're going to have a standard list of questions, longer than this, but you get the idea. We're going to be saying, is this still acceptable? Can we ignore it? Was an expected known trade-off. So we made decisions earlier. We knew some things might happen, but it's not a big deal. So we might have expected it. So you see the list, you end up going all the way to the bottom, and the list should start to sound like this. Can we be the disruption? Why are we reacting to disruptions? Is it a problem? Is there an opportunity? So that's why we have a square that represents the window of opportunity and a priority matrix that we want to use here. We'll take a look at that. I'm sure you've seen urgent versus important as we start to look at multiple disruptions and what we want to work on. So there's really actually a lot of different matrices. The best case is really to use multiple ones. So I say collect as many of these as you can. And here we have to turn problems into opportunities. Focusing just on the problem can increase our fixation and reduce innovation. So lots of examples where innovation started as a problem. A famous one is penicillin, or an experiment that went wrong. It was left out. Wasn't what I expected to have happen. I could have just thrown it away and started again, but looked at it and said, this is interesting. What can I do with this? So the whole point is we already have plenty of disruptions. The problem is we just dismiss them as problems and not opportunities. And so at the top we see, even under a short period of time, we call it an emergency, but that also means it's a window of opportunity. And as we move through this list, you can see how this would help you start to move your thinking into opportunity thinking, which changes your way that you're thinking about it and the questions that you'll ask, all the way down to the bottom, which means ultimately, if you're only seeing problems, we call that a pessimist, and you're actually becoming part of the problem rather than an optimist on the right-hand side. So that leads us into investigation. And this is looking at the gap analyses. The triangle represents the gap, and then analyses down to root causes and factors. So you see the list of questions. And the point here really is that you could say the current state is negative. It's not working. The desired state is the benchmark. What's it supposed to do, or what are other people doing? And you could also say the current state's positive. Things are going well. The desired state's aspirational. We just want to get better, have a new invention. So you define the gap, and then the gap analyses. Most of you have heard of the ask why 5 times. That's for root causes. A lot of times it's difficult in very complex situations to identify the root cause, but we can identify root factors. In plane accidents, they look at this. They'd say, well, the plane did crash. It was snowing. The mixture that they poured on the wings was a little off. It was kind of a newer pilot. Did that cause the plane accident? Well, the plane that took off just before that one had the same factors, but took off. But we can't always find the exact cause, but we can recognize factors. And that goes for positive things as well. People that are successful, what are the root factors that we can analyze? And look at the things that we're doing well, not just what's not working. Bringing in appreciative inquiry. Let's take a look at, so here's a real example of appreciative inquiry. The right front wheel stopped working on the Mars rover. NASA could not solve the problem. So finally they asked, okay, what's still working? And asking that question took them into a different place. They could drive the rover backwards. So with the stuck wheel dragging behind, it pushed away the top layer of soil to reveal a new discovery, salt, which meant there was once water on Mars. So the way that we think about our current state can affect our future state. And this is the importance of appreciative inquiry and not just solving a problem and asking what went wrong when we're in investigation. So that takes us to the diamond. And the diamond represents the divergence, then convergence of ideas. Let's take a look at the box at the bottom, which really summarizes this list that we see. Ideation needs lots of ideas. It's not the place to create the one best idea. Instead, start with question storming, then crazy idea storming, then possible idea storming, then finally idea selection to move to expectation. So If you're not familiar with question storming, it's brainstorming of the question you should be asking before you jump into brainstorming of answers with assumed questions. And I see a lot of people that really want this diamond to be an arrow. I've got an idea, this is what we should do. And it really takes time to go through this process and expand all the ideas up with crazy idea 1 and crazy idea 2. After you look at them, you realize that one piece of one and the other might come together into something you would not have thought of. So we want to make sure that we're using the diamond approach in ideation. In expectation, we want to go, what's the development stage? That's the key thing here. We're going to look at this from an agile standpoint. Is it just a thought experiment? So it's a picture of the concept, and that's okay. Or maybe we want to test it, and it's a proof of concept, or a prototype, or pilot, or we're ready to plunge, and we're ready for a patch or be into production. So that's the key things that we want to think about, how to move through those agile stages from an idea in your head into something that's into production. And with affirmation, that's when we say, okay, do we have the right use case? We might say it works. Great, it works. Based on what use case? Have we thought about things that could still happen and tested for that? Can we eliminate false positives? What do we mean that something's true, that it works? So we want to be aware of the reality of truth table, and that's why this shape represented here is a rectangle. And finally, automation. So this is when we're thinking about how to roll something out and work in routine. We want to ask questions and ask them in a specific order. So this is sort of a true story. I was working in a design with other people there. I had all the right people for workflow and screens that would help workers do something. And it started off thinking about how to fill out this form and how to get people trained on doing it. And you spend an hour on that. And then finally someone says, I think that we can simplify this. They don't need to fill out all of this. Okay, so then we spend time on simplifying it. And then someone says, actually, we can connect to this other database and automate some of this and pre-fill it. Oh, okay, I wish we'd known that. And then finally someone says, we don't need this. That's not even needed for the decision they need to make. You could eliminate it. So there's a specific order you want to think about in designing for proficiency. And this will give you a start on that. All right, so quick summary. Start with a dream, start with goals, start with a process, but make sure that you can capture wherever someone's at and then move them through the story structure. Okay, documentation. Why do we hold our finger on a chess piece? If you play chess or watch chess, you ever think about that? The point is, when we let go, then that current list of options will consequentially move into a new set. So business decisions are the same way. You're saying, why are we stuck with this decision? Well, last year we went with this vendor, and that's the way their product works. So this is looking at ways to capture that type of logic, a decision tree versus an option outline. So on the right, it just says, my friend will pay for my meal today, but I have to choose which meal it's going to be, what I might order. And if I start with dinner, if you're going to buy, okay, how about dinner? And then I start thinking, you're buying? Okay, how about steak? So I can capture my thought process of how I move through narrowing something down. And when I apply that, we'll take a look at one example to the workforce here. This is saying, well, let's use it for itself. Let's use an option outline on itself. Do humans need to make complex decisions? No, they don't. Or the option could be, no, they do. If that's your choice, then we'll move down to the next level. Do humans find tools helpful? No. Or, yeah, I think they do. Okay, that's my choice. So then we see that our thinking moves through, so I can capture with transparency my decision-making process of my final choice. And then here's a real example. Due to project documentation, 70 years of lost knowledge has delayed progress with nuclear power. So as I say, imagine a world without the disasters of Chernobyl and Fukushima. We tend to document projects as if someone only wants to repeat what we did. instead of also showing rejected ideas, which may be the needed idea for a future project. So when we think in terms of knowledge management and lessons learned, like this was the wrong way, we want to document a little bit differently when we're thinking about innovation management, because the ideas that we throw away might be the very thing that we're looking for on the next project. So here we see that we started off, we discovered thorium. It's abundant, it's safe. It just didn't produce a bomb for the Manhattan Project. And they found that uranium did. So after World War II, what did we do? We wanted to say, well, let's use what we discovered here with energy plants. Did we consider thorium? Did we go back and look at that? No, it was lost. The idea was lost, and we are using uranium now. So this is not to prove that thorium will actually work. It's there's a plant that's built now and it's being tested. The point is there still has been a long delay and lost knowledge because of the way that we document what we've learned. Speaking of learning, when we say learning, some people think that means being trained. Okay, behavioralism, if then, here's what to do, just memorize these steps. And some people recognize that it's what we call cognitivism. It's process information. But what we need to reach is learning as in constructivism, story understanding, where we're constructing knowledge. That's what we mean by learning and learning organizations that produces innovation. And you can align learning objectives to even test people for their skills along the way, including up to the ability to test for understanding, which the current models don't allow us to do. Learning also means learning to work with, not against AI. It's interesting that ChatGPT is already in need of a new underlying model. Speaking of replacing our models, just this week, OpenAI CEO said that the age of giant AI models is already over. Their underlying model, which is go out and discover a whole lot of information. Once you've looked through the whole internet, you're kind of done with that model. So that's another interesting story about where we're at in AI. With innovation, I say, look, current AI will not take your job, but someone using AI will. So continually learn to review AI capabilities and tools related to your work. And in our masterclass, we go into all of these in a lot more detail. So quick question, does your organization use, I'm curious, ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI? Just a quick yes or no if you're already into this, if you could type yes or no into the chat. Seeing lots of yeses and nos. It looks like overall that the yeses kind of win here. And just for an example, ask me how I created this image. So I just typed, draw me a picture of a robot's hand on a PC mouse. So that's all I had to do, and that's created this image for me. So there's tools that can do all kinds of things that help us in the creative state, and we shouldn't just dismiss them. So a quick look at leadership. Leaders need to influence and understand and balance those two. Otherwise, if you've got too much desire to influence and not enough to understand, you're like a tree that doesn't have a good root system when a big storm comes. And so we call it the sophomore leader who reaches a point that really wants to influence with not a lot of understanding. And that they work out okay, maybe in an operational environment, but for innovation, leadership and innovation, that might be a place where innovation is being stalled in your organization. And also in the way that we define and develop leaders, Leadership Quarterly summarized 25 years of research saying present practices are primitive. Say that 3 times fast. So the new profiles are not just looking at dichotomies. Okay, I'm an introvert or an extrovert or whatever. It's like if you're leading change, let's measure it against change. Of course, the attributes of a leader, they need to have vision, courage, patience, and all of these things. It's not just a list. There's particular places as you're moving through transformational change that they're really, really important. and you can measure and see where you want to develop your skills there. Also, leadership is about developing the organization, the team, and the individuals. So you might look even at the organizational structure, how in transformational change that you're looking at a matrix for open innovation ideas, whereas maybe a hierarchy would still work okay for control and fast escalation in transactional work. And hierarchy, not for the sake of top down, but also for the sake of bottom up and how fast to escalate. And for the team, there's team dysfunctions that people know about and skills that you can work on, and where they will more likely show up as you see them mapped against story structure. And same thing for individuals. Forbes posted personality traits of successful entrepreneurs, and we can do a deep dive on that to develop people and on those traits as they align up to where they would be useful in the story structure. So quick conclusion. We're talking about managing ideas and developing 4 learner types. Again, HR is not sure what to do with the pioneer, so sometimes they leave. It's hard to measure them. So we have development plans that you would want to have in place rather than saying that we develop from novice to expert, because that's not going to get you through innovation. And this is a quick review of my work, which I thought they summarized better than I did, so I'll use their words. Lewis poses the tantalizing proposition that poor results in education, innovation, and policymaking are rooted in a breakdown between the rational mind and the fundamental models that govern institutions. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm saying, but they said it better. So there you go. And finally, the most difficult innovation that you will probably confront is the reinvention of yourself or your organization. And at some point, you have to stop trying and start trusting. It's called the backwards law. Philosopher Alan Watts said this. So it's easier to pull a rope than to push it, and you will pull in your affirmation. Once you've done your due diligence, don't jump to this too soon, and you're waiting for someone to acknowledge that you're there, you're doing innovation, you're learning, then, if you know who you are, you don't have to prove who you are. That's what this is saying. This is saying just be the change. You can do it. Okay? All right. Well, thanks for attending today. I'm John Lewis, and I hope that this material will help you on your innovation journey. Back to you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, John. Did you want to field any questions while we still have a bit of an audience here? I was wondering if anyone had any questions to ask John before we do our final wrap up. Feel free to post it in chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, we'll give you a few seconds here. Okay. All right. If no questions, then let us know if you'd like more information on the certification class coming up end of June, and we'll be happy to help you with that. Lori and myself and our team, we're on standby to field questions, to send more information, or if you'd like a discounted quote. Our audience here today will get a discount on the class, so I'll send more information on what we mean by that a little bit later. And I think that's it for us. John?
That's it for me. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We'll have the recording ready in a few days, and you'll be the first to for us to notify. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye for now.